So at this point, folks, we're going to talk about the actual writing of the thesis, conducting your independent research. So this will take us through the nitty-gritties of it. Okay. The writing process itself. So what are we going to cover? It's things like the structure, the layout, what's your abstract and introduction, the literature review, methods, findings, discussion, conclusion, appendices. All of this is going to be covered in this next section. So the purpose, of course, of the abstract, that's like your summary. This is where you're setting out your objective. What's the objective of your research question? What is it you're planning on doing, investigating? How are you going to do that? It's an outline of the overall thesis. And you can see there roughly about 150 to 200 words. So it's a summary of your studies. The introduction then, it's to give you some context. What's the background, the history? What are you seeking to explore here? What's your expectations of the research? That's the kind of thing that tends to go into the introduction. The literature review itself, now this is where you say you're searching library search, or you're searching, government papers, or you're searching through databases, and you're identifying all of these particular sources that's relevant to your area. And some of those sources may agree or disagree, it can be a compare and contrast, but it basically gives you a way of establishing what's the existing knowledge of this particular topic. And it shows your thesis supervisor that you have read widely on this. You've done your research, you've looked at every possible angle. So not only is it to discuss, if you like, all of these different sources and obviously referencing and citing them correctly, but you need to synthesize it, so there mightn't be all agreed positions, but there could be contrasting ones. And you need to establish your own voice in this. So from this, you're establishing what needs to be investigated and how you're going to do that. So if you like, you're identifying themes and concepts within the literature and how you're going to answer it in your own research. So this is all key. It's not just a summary of everything that's out there. It's identifying gaps. It's identifying, I suppose, what you're going to prove in your own thesis, the new knowledge you're going to add to it. And there's a very good source, SAGE Research Methods core database that will help you in looking at literature review. And I'd suggest that that's worthwhile looking at. Okay. In terms of your methods, so again, this may depend on the discipline you're coming from, because different disciplines will require different types of methods to be used. So in general, as a broad kind of statement, there's a difference. There's qualitative methods and there's quantitative methods. On the qualitative side, you've got things like understanding opinions, motivations and reasons, and that may take the form of things like interviews, focus groups, ethnography, things like that. In the quantitative methods, you're problem solving. You're usually working with some form of data and statistics. So it could be things that you're using, maybe like surveys and polls and so on. And again, down the end of that slide there, you'll see that the SAGE Research Methods database does have a section there on research design. Again, really useful to help you with this. In the findings and discussion then, it's from the data you've collected to categorize, organize, manage your findings. How do you analyze this? You've got themes, then discuss those findings in depth and with reference to the literature in your discussion section. Your findings may also be displayed. You could have graphs, diagrams, tables. Again, it depends on the type of method that you're using. And again, you can refer on to the SAGE database for information on the writing up of that. The conclusion then is not just about being a summary of everything you've written. It's not just that. You need to discuss your findings thematically, synthesizing them. So what's your voice? What's your finding in all of these things? You need to be including some sort of adding something new, if you like, to it. It's not just a summary of everything that you've read and written about. And again, how does it relate back to your research question? So all the time it has to go back to your original question. What's your contribution and what's your story? You might also be briefly mention the gaps that have emerged. Maybe that's even for further study. Or there may be recommendations for future researchers in this field. So that's a good conclusion. That'll give you some guidance for your thesis. Appendices worth mentioning here because first and foremost, this can help you where you're working with a particular word count. There may be more information that you want to add, but you don't want to send up your word count. So if you include it in the appendices, that's outside of your word count. It's not included. So it's really useful. Also, if you're doing things like interviews, things like that, you might decide to show the questions or just transcripts in the appendices, particularly when you're referring to it, or you might want additional graphs or tables of content or data sets there, maybe even photographs could be relevant. So anything that's in there, though, should be labeled and titled if it's referenced within the body of your thesis. Okay. So as a checklist for your research, just have a quick look down through the list. Is your proposal coherent? Have you sure you have the resources, including the time, of course, to do the work, very importantly. The risk assessment. Is there any ethical issues? And again, this might be something to discuss with your supervisor. They can kind of advise you on that. Have you got a timetable worked out? How much time do you have before you have to present your thesis? You need to allow enough for all of that. During the research stage, are you keeping to your timetable? Are you maintaining records of all your results? As I mentioned, very importantly that you track all your sources and that they're all cited and referenced properly. And again, the session tomorrow, if you attend that with my colleague Kieran Quinn, he will offer advice and guidance on referencing. And are you writing as you're going along? How are you doing it? It's probably important to keep a momentum going with your thesis. Okay. So folks, at this point, I'd just like to recap on what we've covered in this session. We looked at different types of sources, how to find those sources. We've looked at searching and, the advanced search option, which again, all databases will have, as well as library search. We've talked about how you're evaluating that information. How can you decide what's relevant or not for your thesis? And then the actual writing process itself, all the different parts that need to be considered in writing up your thesis.